too. So,
Okay, sounds
okay.
good.
Okay, Kieran, I have been so excited to have you on the show. I know we've tried to do this interview a few times. I'm really excited you're here with me today. So, first of all, welcome to the show. And
Appreciate that.
yeah, man. And I wanted to ask you, do you have a glass of wine going right now, or what do you have there?
No,
Just
that's just some water right now. Yeah. No.
okay. No, I saw it look like a wine glass, and I was like, I kind of want to do that too. But I've got
There
my
you go.
coffee going now. But Kieran, let's start off by you just giving us a quick snapshot of who Kieran Nair is, and then we'll dive into everything we want to talk about today.
Thanks. Yeah. And first off, I just want to say thank you for having me on and for producing the great content you've been producing over these last several years. I've been really enjoying it. In terms of who I am as Kieran Nair, I'm an early 40s hospitalist living out here in BC. I have my lovely wife Nadine and three kids between the ages of 7, 15, which are keeping me very, very busy. I have a lot of interests outside of medicine. One of our ones that we spend a lot of time talking about is obviously in the finance world, in both personal finance and then as well around value investing, which I've been studying kind of since residency overall. That joy and love has kind of led me to write the Financially Free MD blog, which I think I've previously done in the past and unfortunately let go. But outside of that, just love participating in sports and recently in the last several years, I've been involved in more kind of administrative roles in medicine as well. So doing a lot of different things.
I want to give people some context about how we got to know one another, how we became friends. So there was an episode that I had released. I was with Andrew Hallam, and on that episode, I had talked about some of the struggles had been experiencing myself committing to my own investing strategy. And Karen, you were kind enough to reach out to me then, and we had a great phone conversation. And you kind of heard me out, gave me some advice along the way on how I could build something that I could stick to. And that's kind of for me where it took off. And recently, we had a great time just kind of chatting away over brunch in Toronto. So Kieran, thank you for that, by the way. And I always love talking to you. And I want to just start off by getting your perspective on some of the challenges that we mid career physicians can experience because you took some time 3 months ago or so when you were coming back from your year away in the French Riviera, which we're going to get to. And you talked about some of the challenges that you yourself had experienced once you hit mid career because I can say for myself, approaching the 10-year point of radiology, Kieran, you start to get a little bit more comfortable, things start to get a bit more routine, and then we have this tendency, at least I have, to pick up new responsibilities, to pick up new obligations. And I even hit a point where it started to eat away at me for a little bit of time. And I can talk about my experience too, but I want to know about your experience, some of the challenges that you faced mid career, because I think this is going to resonate with a lot of people listening today.
Yeah, definitely. I think it is a significant issue that a lot of people experience in mid-career. And first off, I think I'm the last person to be giving a prescription for the right way to go about this because, as you know, a big reason why I took the year away was after experiencing significant burnout related to everything that I had taken on in the mid-career setting. Um, I think we start off as we come out of residency or as a professional into the beginning early stages of your career. You start off really focusing on trying to maintain your competency in what you're doing and the practice of whatever it is you've taken on as a profession, and you're quite fixated on that, and it's exciting in that early phase of things. And speaking for myself, at that time you also add on trying to build a family and having kids. And while you're finding you might be getting some competence in your career, you find out very quickly you have very little competence in being a parent. It's a very
Yeah.
significant challenge, and you're constantly facing new things that you thought you knew how to handle, and you can't handle at all. And so for those first 5 years, I found that for myself, it was just a constantly challenging environment of learning in a new setting, and then managing the balance of sleep and your own personal health and everything else that goes along with that. I think for my situation with three kids, it took until about 5 to 7 years after residency where I started to find, okay, I'm getting a balance back in my life. Feel like I have a feel of this parenting thing doing okay in my career. I feel like I'm competent in the practice of medicine, and I was finally starting to get my health back on track. You know, losing that extra weight you put on from eating all the kids' leftovers and whatnot. That
Yeah, yeah, I still do it, man.
yeah, yeah, you got to let that frugality part of your life like go to let some of the food go to waste instead of eating it all, right? But you know, for myself, I think at that point it was, you know, okay, well, what's the next challenge that I can kind of take on? And although I was very focused on the finance side of life and learning investing, I was also feeling somewhat comfortable in that and was looking for something else. And you know, in my setting, I was fortunate enough to have some colleagues say they thought I might be able to take on some different roles more on the administrative side of medicine, and I did see some value in that, given that you know the quality of how we deliver healthcare is an important thing, and I got myself more engaged with those kind of activities, both you know as a hospitalist lead in the province, but then also negotiating contracts, and I found it very interesting and the learning curve that was going along with it. But I find that it's insidious how these things can happen, where sometimes you take on these extra roles and responsibilities, and then you can slip away the other things that you know are important to you, but you're kind of pushing them aside because they feel like they can go on the back burner a bit. And you know, specifically in my situation in the mid-career, the other thing that was very significant to leading to my burnout is that I had a once, what I perceived at the time as a once in a lifetime opportunity where I got offered a role as a partner in a biotech venture capital firm, which really melded that aspect of medicine that I really enjoyed, but also finance. And it felt like this is kind of a unique opportunity I'm never going to get again. And I
Mhm.
happened at the same time that I was taking on these administrative roles and managing my young family. And very quickly things start to catch up on you. And it's can be very insidious how all this burnout creeps up on you, but you feel a lot of difficulty getting away from it, right? So I think we're type A personalities that tend to take things on and like to have new challenges in life, but we have to make sure it's not letting that bigger aspect of what we care about the most in our lives to slip away.
Can you tell us a bit more about how you knew that you were maybe starting to take on too much? What was going on in your life around that time that was a clear signal to you that there's too much going on and maybe things need to change?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wish I could say I figured it out quickly, but it didn't. It was something that built over about a year and a half. And I think the first thing that I started to notice in myself was that sleep was starting to be something that was starting to be affected significantly, where I would wake up in the middle of the night after a couple hours and automatically my mind would go to all the challenges that I knew I was facing at that moment in time and thinking through the problems and thinking how I was going to solve them. I think in addition to that, I should have listened. I had an early warning sign from my wife who said, I can see this is happening in you. You have a lot on your plate. I think you need to pull back some of the responsibilities. But again, as a type A individual who likes taking on challenges, and historically, I think as physicians, we're served well by our type A-ness. You know, it helped us get to where we are in life. We had to study hard and work hard, and
Hmm.
it's such a positive benefit to where we are that you don't have the ability to withdraw from something very easily. And despite her warnings and saying that this was something that was starting to occur, I kept on saying, you know, I can see it's just another 6 months. I can balance this all out a little bit further. And unfortunately, these time commitments didn't easily end at any point in time, which was another part of the challenge. For me, the one that was a real stark situation that struck a chord, it kind of is ingrained in my memory now, but I had a moment where I was downstairs in this very room, stuck in a meeting. Somebody came, I could hear kind of noise happening upstairs of, you know, children's tears and some arguing going on. And I came up looking to kind of quickly solve the problem because I had the next thing to move on to. And I was talking to my middle son and trying to solve it, but trying to solve it in a very quick way instead of really listening to him. And he suddenly had a big statement and said, "You know what? You're never here, and all I really want is your time, and you never give it to me." And it was a devastating thing. It was as a parent, that's kind of one of those things that you would hope to never hear. But that was essentially what it took to really hit me like a ton of bricks to have the self-realization, wow, this has slipped away on you, and you need to get back on track.
Kieran, that's a very powerful moment. I mean, in a way, I can sympathize with that because for me, what I was experiencing end of 2022 going into 2023 was a lot of clinic work piling up, and there'd be very busy days at the hospital followed by very busy shifts that I was taking on from home. And I vividly remember one day, I talked about this recently, where I came home after a grueling day at the hospital, walked in the door, had no time to decompress. Both my sons came at me. Each was asking me for something specific. And all I could think about were the 200 cases that were building up on my work list that I had to get to. And in that moment, I truly felt broken. And I told my kids that I had my own little outburst, and everyone stopped what they were doing. And when I look back, that was my moment where I knew something had to change. It took me about 6 months from there to implement the changes, but we all have, I think, these moments that just hit us like a ton of bricks. I really appreciate you taking the time to share yours, and that was mine. Kieran, going on from there, tell us maybe about one, what kind of changes did you make? And maybe using your own experience, you can talk to us a bit about, do you have any guidelines that we can follow for making sure that the things we are taking on are truly aligning with what we want to do, and putting in some checkpoints to make sure that we're not putting or taking on too much?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's something I spent a significant part of the time on that sabbatical year really thinking
Hmm.
about because it was a big contributing factor to why we made the decision as a family that it was a worthwhile thing to experience amongst others. I think that the first thing is to again really have your key focus of what your core goals are, of where you're at in life, what your key missions are. And
Hmm.
in that year, it was very clear to me, and that without a doubt, the top three things for me is my immediate family, my children, making sure that I'm providing everything I can as a parent and a father and a husband in that setting, and that's the paramount issue. Number two was my health because I had some issues we may get into an additional thing that when your health isn't there, suddenly you're not able to necessarily provide on all these other fronts. And number three was my close personal relationships with friends and maintaining that. I realized that those were my key three things. Um, Now, that doesn't mean we can't have other missions in life. I realize that even though those are your three most important things that you care about in terms of maintaining and ensuring you're providing your utmost best, there's other spheres in time that might not interfere with those moments. And
Hmm.
finding missions or additional hobbies and interest when you can kind of create a clear boundary of the time around those activities where it doesn't
Hmm.
interfere with the others. Specifically with the two roles that I was taking when I look back, it was the fact that there was random evening meetings that would suddenly come about urgently that I have to do for negotiating. And it felt like there was a constant urgent need to these settings, but they would happen to fall when a soccer game was on or when dinner time was supposed to be there, when it was
Hmm.
family time. And it was the nature of, a bunch of physicians getting together with administrators. It was the only time that we could provide. Take that into the venture capital role, it was the same idea. Suddenly we would have an opportunity and an investment that would require really advanced due diligence, really putting a lot of time and effort into it, and then immediately talking to investors and trying to fundraise around that. And it would just kind of happen unexpectedly. And now your next week is looking totally different than it was before. And the immediate places you take from are the areas that I was talking about earlier that are the key areas of life because you feel like you can push them off temporarily. So I found it moving forward, if there's things that I know can fall during the hours of when my kids are at school and not
Hmm.
into the evenings, creating a clear boundary on where this time is protected time, I think is the key issue to make sure you're maintaining your key missions and taking care of yourself first and your family.
I think that discussion on boundaries is really, really important. Now, Kieran, just going to your professional missions right now, how many things are you actively taking part in right now? And then a follow up question to that is, realistically, how many professional missions do you think one can have and do well? I know there's some individuality to this answer. Everyone's different, but would love your take on it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for myself, experiencing what I went through, I made the active choice to really pull back and kind of start back at square one and then try to rebuild back upwards. So I made sure that when I left for the year, I passed on responsibilities to others to help take on the role in the negotiating setting that I was doing and kind of seeing through on contractual issues. And in terms of the president role in the Doctors of BC, I've actually just taken a step back. I'm going to maintain on the executive setting from that point of view. But I felt like starting back at square one would be a very helpful thing for myself because this goes to a bit of the sabbatical. I found that my ability to be present in my family's life was an essential thing. And the first and foremost thing would be to get myself back to square one, to only build back things that will fit into that scheduled life where I can fit it into time periods that work well for me. So honestly, I'm still quite focused on just being present in my family's life and not.
Before we get to your year away, because I think everyone really wants to hear about it, a couple quick questions. You wrote me a very thoughtful email 3 months ago, and in that you had been very candid and you talked about some health issues that you had experienced, which you described as the nail in the coffin. Can you talk to us about this, Kieran? Because this, in fact, when you wrote that email, it came to me at a time when I was hearing about a lot of bad things happening, people getting sick, and it just really made me stop in my tracks and just tell myself, our health is not something we can take for granted. Yes, we want to achieve and do all these other things, but we can't do it compromising our health and our wellness along the way. So, if you're willing to talk about it, I'd just kind of love to hear because it was very powerful for me.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, I think, as we were talking about earlier, the signs of burnout that were accruing in my life and those poignant moments, if that wasn't enough, around the same time, I had been paying attention to what you just described. I've been seeing some health issues in friends around me, and I'd also been, in the nature of medicine, we see the fleeting nature of life, where young people are getting significant illnesses all the time. And going further, at the time we just finally had a chance to meet in person at brunch, I was at my college roommate's a funeral essentially in town for that reason. And so that was a stark reminder again of what's happening in this early 40s is when we start to hear of issues happening in people's health. I had been reading a lot around the idea of longevity and health related to what I do in hospitalist medicine. We obviously see a lot of frail elderly, and in that reading, I was hearing about cardiovascular disease and some of the new developments that were happening there. I knew had a strong family history given the East Indian background of my father and some heart disease that ran there. And fast forward after some additional blood tests and this new blood test, this LP little a that's really come onto the scene more recently, I had found I had significant risk for heart disease. And fast forward another few months, I had multi-vessel coronary artery disease with a 70% block in my right coronary artery, which was a total surprise to me as somebody who's been generally fit, active, non-smoker. It really threw me for a loop. So on top of the general stress that I was experiencing, I felt to me at that moment in time like the stress was eating myself from the inside. Of course, these things were already there from a genetic point of view, but it just added to the picture. And that was another big reason to say this is a moment to try to get a refresh and a big impetus for the sabbatical year that our family took.
That blood test that you mentioned, was that LPA, lipoprotein A?
Yeah, LP little a,
Yeah.
exactly. That's the
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
the test that really showed a big genetic risk factor for me that again, typically like on the old style when we were in medical school, the Framingham
Hmm.
aspect of things, I would not have flagged as somebody that you'd even really consider starting a statin in, but this was the helpful thing. And then
Okay.
once I got in touch with the lipidologist, they said, no, you're somebody we should target aggressively to get on top of treatment. And
Okay.
and I feel super fortunate because now I'm essentially going to be a primary prevention angle of treating my heart disease. But
Absolutely. Yep.
stark reminder that even when we feel fit and healthy in our late 30s, early 40s, it's there can be something underneath there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Kind of, hitting this on right away. Last question before your time away. The one thing I've struggled with is when the kids were young, I felt like those were really, really precious years. My boys are 8 and 11. I feel like for my older son, that golden window, it's still there, but it's coming to an end faster than I think. And I always thought that when the kids were young, maybe that wasn't a great time for me to take on extra responsibilities, extra obligations. But then at some point, we all want to grow and we all want to achieve. Kieran, I'm wondering, based on your experience, because you're a bit further into this parenting game than I am, is there a better time in terms of balancing commitments and time spent with the kids in those golden years? Like, is there an ideal window or a better window than others to start taking on these extra tasks? I'm just would love to know.
Yeah, you and me both, buddy. I'm not sure I know the answer to that right off the hop. Um, it's something that I spent a lot of time thinking about again on that sabbatical year, and I think
Hmm.
there was a sense of false confidence in when I talked about kind of getting out of that early career and early phase of being a parent and having three
Mhm.
kids, that okay, I got this down. I have this parenting balance, I have the work balance, I have the health balance. I can move on and take the additional aspects of what
Mhm.
I want to do in terms of furthering other career aspects. And now having my first adolescent, teenage daughter, I'm telling you, hey, things change quite a bit. There's a totally different dynamic to parenting that you weren't expecting, and oftentimes you have to be just ready to be there in the right moments,
Mhm.
and that requires presence. And so, I think if you follow, at least in my mindset, you follow this idea that the additional challenges and hobbies that I'm going to take on in life, I can compartmentalize them into the timing that isn't impeding on the time and availability to be present in my kid's life, then you're in an okay spot. Then it works well.
Mhm.
But if it is
Mhm.
something that's extending beyond that, you aren't going to know when your child's needs are going to change and you have to be there.
Mhm.
In retrospect, I don't think I was checking in enough with my children when I was at my peak responsibility stage and experiencing that burnout. And that's where that outburst from my son, essentially was just his only way to voice what had probably been building for some time. So I think later in life, can I see a setting under which my kids are, in university and they don't need me as much? Definitely. But does avoiding any extra challenges in life before then, because you don't want to take any chance that you can't be available for them, I don't think that's the right approach either. I think we just have to be very conscientious of what we're doing and have regular check-ins and listening to the people around you, whether that be your spouse and or your children. Are you having the right balance at that moment in time, if that's what's important to you?
That's really well said. Kieran, let's go to your time abroad with your family, a year away in the French Riviera. I've already heard a bit about this, but I want to hear it again, and I know everyone's eager to hear about this. So tell us, what led you to do this?
Yeah, it was such an incredible year that we feel very, very grateful for.
Mhm.
Definitely, I've already mentioned some of the burnout issues, the health issues. For us as a family, we had always been interested in travel and in getting that experience for our children. We had unfortunately been blocked by COVID as we had initially planned our first big trip at that time, kind of waiting for our youngest to get to an age we felt like we could travel. So I think that was also part of the impetus. And luckily enough for us, we had the build out of having the financial freedom and known that. And in retrospect, we had looked back and said this was a big part of why we wanted to be financially free, was to have the ability to make choices that were significant and dramatic to alter our path in life if we felt like we needed to. And at that moment in time, I think I really needed to. So that was a big part of the motivation. It definitely helped that I had a friend who had actually done something similar, and I was living vicariously through him while I was experiencing this burnout
Yeah.
significantly, seeing the beautiful scenery of the French Riviera and Nice, and so he helped convince me in saying, this is something to do right now. And similarly, at that time, I was also reading the Die with Zero book, which I know a lot of people are familiar with in the
I'm
personal
reading
finance
that
world.
right now, Kieran. I'm at the halfway point, and it is reshaping the way I think about things.
Yeah, definitely. And this idea that there's certain times in life that you can do certain experiences and then it might not be there later was something that really rang true with me. And it felt like we quickly turned from how can we do it to a why not situation. And every
Mhm.
single time we looked at why not, it was something that, this was something we were going to end up doing no matter what.
So, given everything you talked about just before this, the stress, the burnout, maybe you can just shed some light on what did this trip, this time away, not working, not doing medicine, this time away with your family, what did this do for you in terms of you resetting as an individual? And then what did it do for you just deepening the connections with your family?
It's funny. As I was getting ready for this, I was thinking back and in that very beginning stage of the excitement of the sabbatical, right? You're getting to this
Mhm.
phase where you're in this beautiful new place. There's a lot of adventure that you're thinking of having, and you're also this type A personality who immediately thinks, I have all this time now. I'm not working. I have all this freedom during the daytime when the kids are gone. And that type A-ness came out immediately with goal orientation. Oh, what kind of exercise challenges can I take on? What is the next thing that I can learn? What books am I going to read? I even went and started thinking I'll do some creative writing. And it took a bit of a moment to say, wait a second, these are the things that got me into this in the first place, this type 8. And,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
I realized I'm in this place for 1 year and we'll probably not have an opportunity like this. Let's learn to be present. This is a muscle that needs to be built that I don't have, that idea of having
Mhm.
presence in life. So I actually, the thing that I really learned the most that year was that ability to push off any degree of feeling like I needed to complete something and to challenge myself and build myself out more as an individual, and instead build that muscle of presence. And being in a beautiful setting with wonderful food and wonderful culture, it makes it easier to do that. So I think it really helped me to bring that into my life. And that was very helpful, I think, in the family setting as well. I think my children felt that as soon as they came home, I was there and I was listening and I was active and trying to learn French along with them as best I could, despite my horrible accent, as they've reminded me regularly. So yeah, it was. That was an element that I don't think I appreciated would be as valuable as it was. I couldn't have known until after the fact.
Okay, it sounds like that your way you learned about the power of being present in the moment. Kieran, this is something I talk about a lot and something I've been learning about over the years. And I have to tell you, I still struggle with it. And I constantly need to remind myself that each and every moment I experience with my kids and my wife, Seema, each moment is precious and it deserves my full attention. That's one thing I continually try to tell myself. The other thing I try to do now in order to be more present is I will go for walks in the neighborhood when I want to take a break and recharge, but I'll make sure I don't have my headphones in. I'll make sure I'm not constantly bombarding myself with something new to learn. Those are just two things that I do, but I still struggle with being present. So maybe can you give us some actionable tips on maybe things that you do to be more present every day?
Yatin, I think I just told you this muscle was so weak in me to begin with that again, you're asking me as if I'm some authority on this dynamic, and I'm going to actually
I
give people some good advice here. But no, I think when you start realizing the value that accrues from being present, that's such a positive self-reinforcing dynamic.
Mhm.
I, like you, had listened to podcasts, read in different settings that talks about creating that space for yourself is a highly valuable thing. But again, as somebody who is goal oriented and at the time previously was incredibly time constrained, you always can convince yourself that it's not quite the right time to do that. You have many other things on the plate to take up your time. I realized that in that present moment, you have some of the best creative thoughts that you can have. A lot of the self-reflection that I was able to put myself through to have the ability to talk about today, in some of these areas that I've grown in is because of that presence, giving yourself time, and that self-reflection. And going back further to the setting of, talking about the value of kids and the value of our presence in their lives, I found that having those moments, we put them through a significant challenge. My kids had some challenging moments without a doubt, one more so than the other three, but being able to take the time in the morning as I was walking, as you said, without headphones, thinking through what they were experiencing, thinking about what I would want to do as a parent in that setting when I was going to sit down with
Mhm.
them, not
Mhm.
feeling stressed about what I had to do later in the day, to be very calm and listen. I had some incredible outcomes with my son who said, you know what, Dad, like these conversations have been super helpful for me. At the tail end of the year, he was saying, I feel like after navigating these challenges, I can do just about anything. I have a lot of
Oh, wow.
confidence now. And
Wow.
as a parent, it's so reinforcing to hear that. It makes you see the value in it. So I think when you get that positive reinforcement around giving yourself time, giving yourself presence, it now makes you realize, okay, I'm not letting this thing go anymore.
I think that in itself, Karen, that is so beautiful, so powerful. That probably made the whole trip worthwhile in itself. I want to ask you, what did you learn about our most precious resource, time, in your year away?
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of the areas where I would say time had value, that space and presence that having extra time gives. The other thing was, going back to the concept of die with zero, it's the idea of time in the right setting is also very, very important. I had the luxury of in that time away, my parents and friends and family were able to visit. And I definitely noticed with my parents, there was an element where although they were really enjoying the trip, there was limitations on what they were able to do physically at some points in our travels. And
Hmm.
so getting that freedom of time to be able to do the things that you want to experience in life in the right setting was highly valuable for me, and made it more present in my mind that I got to create this space while I have the ability. I think, in our last conversation, we were talking about that idea that I always knew but let slip away, where, the quote is 75% of your time that you're going to spend with your child is there by the age of 12, and then 90% is by the time they're 18. And so to have that ability to reflect that this time I have right now is incredibly valuable, is some of the limited time I'm going to have for this experience in life, and making space for it is our most important thing. So having that abundance of time on the sabbatical helped me again realize, the value in these things, and then making sure I carve out the right settings to have my experiences that are most valuable to me.
And Kieran, in your year away, what were your some of your favorite highlights?
Oh, it's hard to pinpoint one. Obviously we were very lucky that the French school system. So my kids were in the French public school system while they were there, and there was the what I call the daytime when they were at school. So my wife and I really got a chance to enjoy the French culture, enjoying different cuisine. Very quickly felt like we could be part of the society there, where we made friends at the school, and through competitive sports, I was able to join a badminton team that they
Oh, that's amazing.
asked me to join, and I basically got to compete and go around to different areas in the south of France to compete on weekends with them.
Wow,
So
wow.
that really, I had a chance to experience living in a different culture. So that was highly valuable for both myself and my wife, and then for the kids to just get a chance to experience a totally different culture and remove themselves from their bubble, right? Like the kids can often get this little microcosm of their school and think this is the only way that the world operates, and this is my truth of what's happening in my life. And they came to a different setting, and none of those things were actually the same in the French school system, right? So it was very eye-opening to them, along with the dynamic of the travel and the experience of what we got to see in the different places we did. The school system there has this idea of 6 weeks of school and then 2 weeks vacation, which allowed us to build in these little mini trips all throughout Europe, along the way. So that experience for them of just experiencing the history that's rich in Europe, the beautiful, scenery and architecture was just incredible for the family.
Any general tips, Kieran, for anybody else who's maybe considering a year away with their family?
Yeah, I think it's something that first off takes a lot of planning. I don't think this should be something that's done on a whim, especially if you're thinking of going for any length of time, like a year. I think if you're going to do a 1 month or 2 month stint, you can probably do it a little bit on more short notice. But it was a significant effort to build out the plan to get them into the French public school system and get long stay visas and whatnot. So we gave ourselves about a year to go through the process of planning
Mhm.
this out. Um, because of the fact that I took the time to reflect on where I was at personally, I think understanding your why you're doing it is also really important, because the difficulties to make this thing happen, and ensure the year goes forward in the way you want, you're going to come across a lot of hurdles along the way. And so I think if you have a strong reason why you're making that decision as a family, will help, as well. Um, Obviously, turning to the finance side of things, the budgeting aspect of thing is important. You have to really plan out how you're going to do this, how much you need to save, and talk to your accountant about the planning. It turned out the timing for us happened to be in such a way where it did fall in 6 months and 6 months into each of our fiscal, financial years, which actually helped quite a bit to balance out kind of a total loss of income. For a full fiscal year would have looked very different in terms of how the tax dynamics work. So I would, recommend people think about that if they're trying to figure out their timing. And the last one would be the what you're going to do with your home, assuming you have a home that you have to manage
Mhm.
while you're away. Um, we felt very fortunate. We ended up paying a little bit more on the property management side, but it was something that we really truly felt like there was no headache, in terms of what was happening with their house when it was being rented. And I
Mhm.
thought that was highly valuable, because I've heard of people having horrible experiences when they go
Yeah.
away. If they
Oh,
if
yeah.
they try to just maximize the total amount of of rent that they can get, which obviously you want to do to some degree because you're about to take on this significant expenditure. But then they had a lot of headaches along the way. So those would be some of the tips I would take on. Lastly, for us, there was a lot of concern about taking your children out of whatever activities they're in, or potentially would this negatively affect their schooling. For us, a big reason why we chose France is our kids were in French immersion. So it felt like no matter what happens academically, they're going to come away with a strong language aspect of things. So, thinking through that pros and cons for what you do on the children front is a highly valuable thing too.
Karen, that's really thoughtful. I'm just curious. So you live outside of Vancouver in BC. How do you compare the cost of living where you are in Canada to where you were in the French Riviera?
The French Riviera in Nice is definitely not one that you would expect to be an affordable place to live in any way, stretch or means.
Hmm.
Specifically, the housing cost and the rental cost is your biggest expense for most people when they go to visit,
Hmm.
because typically you're going at the high tourist season. But you'd be surprised that it's actually a very affordable place to live on aggregate. And when I say that, it's compared to a high cost of living setting in Vancouver. We found overall on our day-to-day living after you took away the cost of the housing, it was something that we were living more cheaply in general than we would have in Vancouver. Cost of food was reasonable when going shopping. Cost of public transport was reasonable, and despite not really having any, we were privately funded for healthcare. The healthcare costs were incredibly reasonable as well. So overall, it caught me off guard to some degree at how reasonably affordable it was to manage it.
Now that you have this incredible experience under your belt, I'm really curious, Karen, would you guys down the road one day consider living somewhere else other than Canada?
You know, in the reflection as we were leaving Nice, it was, we didn't really miss home because we knew we were going to be coming back after the year.
Mm.
That was kind of ironclad in our position that we were definitely coming back. Work had given us this break, but we needed to be back at a certain time. But it felt like we were mourning this. Had built a community there and built friends and built a life where the kids were, upset to leave as well at the same time. And to think of it as just an extended vacation that we were never going to experience again was something that left us feeling, wrong inside. It didn't feel correct. So I think it's going to have a special place in our heart always. And we've actually already mentally committed that we are going to get back there. We've tentatively scheduled off March of 2026 to just go back and get to see our friends again, because that'll build that relationship further and experience. And I think that we know that our place is in Canada. As a physician, we
Mm.
practice here. It wouldn't be easy to practice anywhere else. And I think we love our community that we live in. But that area of the world is in a retirement setting is something that is definitely elevated in our minds as a place that we would want to be.
I think that's really exciting. And I could tell you your journey, your story of that year away, Karen, it's really inspiring to me. I hope one day that we can also embark on something like that as well. Now, to be able to do it, one has to be in a certain financial position as well. I know you said you were renting your house, so now let's segue into the financial side of things. I'd love to know for you and Nadine, what do you think were the key actions or the key practices for both of you that allowed you to get your financial journey set up in the right direction and to allow you to get to where you are today, to allow for an amazing year away? Like what were the key things that you guys did that really played a big role in accelerating your financial journey?
Yeah, it's a great question. I felt at the time of residency is where I moved forward on starting to realize that the aspect of personal finance in my life would be something that had a significant role in determining our financial future and the freedoms that we would get to experience. And a big part of that was the timing I came out of residency was around that 2008, 2009 financial crisis. And I was seeing the attendings around me talk about how their retirement plans were decimated and they had no idea what was going to happen to their future. And I also heard a lot of them talking about what they were doing next in their financial positioning, which was completely different than another physician across the way. And I could tell that their level of understanding was limited in terms of what they were doing. And they often had just farmed this issue out to their advisors who now they were doubting of whether they actually were providing them with the best advice. So they were feeling completely paralyzed as to what to do next. And I realized this is not something I can allow myself to feel. If medicine is my profession, understanding personal finance and the investing of the cash that we take in to provide for our retirement is going to be my business. That was the kind of mental check that I put myself through at that point in time. And so very quickly, our goals were to start understanding finance and getting a good financial plan right in the very beginning of coming out and making our first dollar as a physician. And luckily enough, we at that time I felt we didn't have the experience to know how to do that on our own. So I had what I consider overall a good financial advisor who helped us craft a financial plan that set these goals in place, and a lot of it adhered towards giving us freedom and flexibility later in life. So that was something that was highly valuable. I think a financial plan when you're starting out is key, and understanding your financial values. There's nothing more important than that.
Kieran, I can tell you that the way you were thinking back then as a resident, you were thinking beyond your years. Because I can tell you when the great financial crisis was starting, I was a third year medical student. I was on a plastic surgery rotation. And maybe people around me were talking about the stock market tanking and that this was going to impact them. But I can tell you that I was absorbing nothing of that. Like I did not have the wherewithal to start thinking in the way that you did. So, what I would love to know is how did you get so interested in this? And then specifically, how did you get so interested in investing? Because from our last conversation, you were telling me that you didn't grow up in a house where these subjects were talked about frequently. In fact, you were telling me about some of the conversations that you and your parents had when you were away in the French Riviera, and that your approach is in fact quite different. You were maybe growing up in a somewhat risk-averse household. So I want to know, how did you get so interested in finance and investing? Because I can tell you the opportunity was there for me too. I didn't seize it at the time. You did.
Yeah, again, I think it's a confluence of a number of things all at once. Another anecdote story that really struck home, and I think is worthwhile to tell you, is
Mhm.
again, freedom was a big part of things, and travel was a big part of our lives at that moment. And I was planning on doing 1 month of work, and then my wife and I planned a trip to Southeast Asia to kind of celebrate before we had a chance. We knew we were going to have a young family soon, and we're planning on that in the near future, and thought this is a chance of doing something that again we can only experience at a certain time of life. And I was like, sharing that with a physician colleague that was a physician attending that we had in the emergency department, and he was saying, he was listening closely and quickly said, that sounds amazing. I wish I could do something like that at some point in my life. And I was thinking, this guy's in his 40s. He's had a chance to save for how long? And he's telling me he's essentially living paycheck to paycheck. And he was saying, I have my boat, I have my expensive house. He was divorced, and he had all these things working against him on a cash flow front that were not allowing him this freedom. So I think the element of understanding finance to me was really paramount at that point in time. And as you mentioned, I grew up in a risk adverse household, but I had this other experience in life where in my 20s I'd become a avid poker player, and I kind of somewhat understood the dynamic of risk as it's measured in certain scenarios. So I think that naturally pulled me in a direction of understanding risk and risk mitigation in a slightly different way than most people would at that young age. So I attribute some degree to that. And then I just got this concept ingrained in my mind that it really became apparent that investing early and having a
Mhm.
long time horizon appeared to clearly be the most valuable thing, bar none. It stuck with me as a fundamental principle that the more dollars that could be invested early would just have this compounding growth. Essentially, I think I'd started reading around Warren Buffett quite a bit at that point in time and understanding the finance, and he had this analogy of what's called the snowball effect. And
Mhm.
it was this snowball starts at the top of a hill and it's rolling. It's just a tiny snowball, but as it's rolling down the hill, it's just picking up a little bit more snow all the way along. And as it grows in size, it's picking up more snow. And suddenly you have this compounding effect that is immense in the latter stages of investing. And I just kept on thinking, I'm 20 something right now. And if I can get started right now, what an effect it's going to have. And that principle just got me so excited that I delved in deeply into the topic of all things personal finance.
Kieran, you have a very interesting journey. So you talked about developing an interest in poker. You were a poker player. You became a savvy investor. You spent a year in the French Riviera. Like, sounds like a great book to me. Like, it's just, it's just fascinating, right? Like, you have such an interesting journey. Now, you told me two interesting things at our brunch about a month ago, and you talked about this concept of, okay, I'm going to pour my heart into medicine, but then I'm also going to pour my heart into thinking about how I allocate capital. And you essentially treat that like your second job, your second responsibility. That really hit home for me. And then we talked about investing in stocks versus investing in ETFs. And you had some really insightful comments about why knowledgeable individual investors can have an edge. You talked about one of them. One is allowing yourself to think really, really long term and enjoying that snowball effect. But Kieran, maybe elaborate a bit more on why individuals who are curious and want to learn, those people investing in stocks, like why can they or how can they develop an edge?
Yeah, I think first of all, I want to put a caveat on this in the setting of, what I'm about to describe and talk about in this area is likely not necessarily fitting the pattern of what most of the professionals that listen to your podcast would this wouldn't be advice that I would necessarily give them in the setting that, as you know, we both agree that ETF investing is clearly one. Index investing is a great way to go when you have limited time, limited interest in pursuing the study of investing and the different aspects, specifically of value investing, which I think both of us have an interest in. But when it comes down to the dynamics of actually truly understanding active investing as in our form versus the passive investment flows of what ends up happening, I think the two or three insights that I kind of had early on was that often the dynamic for active managers, there's somewhat perverse incentives that are happening in terms of how they decide to invest their fund flows overall. They're very incentivized to build assets under management overall. That is how they're going to make the majority of their income. And oftentimes, being very different than the index is actually not intuitive, and it's not going to be beneficial for them to raise capital overall as fund managers. And the reason for this is that often when there is the natural vagaries of the market that end up happening, people will look to what they're invested in, and if they see big blue chip stock names overall, they are going to end up feeling comfortable. Well, at least they're invested in common things that I understand and I see, versus most of the variance and potential alpha that might be able to accrue, which essentially means above index value returns, can be achieved in looking at some of the more beaten down spaces overall. And so that's one aspect of things. The second aspect is that the element of the dynamic of your long-term time horizon, it took a while to get there for me, but overall, if you can find above averages businesses and hold them for a very long period of time, and this is in the category of what Warren Buffett has kind of talked about, a transition he made from the typical cigar butt investing, which is investing in something that's cheap and then having to sell it very quickly after it approaches intrinsic value. If you can hold long-term compounding investments, it can really achieve an excellent return for you when you find a good quality investment. Now, these are few and far between, but we do have a very long-term time horizon versus most active fund managers are looking in very short time windows overall. The last one you might be alluding to that we talked about that day that I think is missed a lot in the index investing aspect of things is that there's this idea of the percentage of float is applied to index investments. And so to break this down a little bit further, an investment that is being selected will be determined by the percentage of available float to the outside passive investor that can purchase that investment. And if there is a large amount of insider ownership to that is, say, an owner operator that's ran that business for 20 years and kept 30% of their net worth and personal wealth tied to it, only 70% of the float would be available in that example. And so overall, you might be getting a setting under which these individuals who have a high concentration of their personal wealth and have a very strong long-term vision for a company, they are ones that maybe might take care of that investment and the long-term productivity of it in a better way, in my opinion. The stewardship is stronger versus some of the ones that have lower insider ownership. And I think that unfortunately gets missed in index investing, where you might have less percentage ownership of these strong owner operator companies because of it.
Okay, so to summarize, Kieran, that last point, what you're saying is if there's a company that has high inside ownership, in terms of the shares available to the public, there will be fewer shares as a percentage because of the high insider ownership. And as a result of that high insider ownership, that those companies may be slightly underrepresented in the index then?
Correct. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's exactly correct.
Okay. Okay. Now, Karen, we're obviously not going to be throwing out stock picks today, but if for anybody who wants to learn more about the craft of investing, do you have a couple favorite books you might want to share? I know that you and I both enjoyed one by Chris Mayer, 100 Baggers, but I know that you've read a lot on this. Would love to hear.
Yeah, I think the for me the most profound book that helped influence my kind of decision to pursue the art of value investing was definitely The Intelligent Investor. I think it's a relatively accessible book on the whole for early readers, and it gets a concept of this idea of Mr. Market and the vagaries of Mr. Market that has, massive pessimism at certain points in time and massive exuberance. And that idea and the concept of it, and knowing that there is some fluctuations in value of what's happening, even though the market has some degree of efficiency without a doubt, there are these moments in time that can lead to changes in valuation because of it. And for the individuals that are able to behavior modify around that to feel comfort in the buying at massive pessimism moments, that will be a beneficial thing for you. And I think that's true for ETF investing, even if you're not pursuing active investing as well. So that simple concept, I think, is highly valuable. In terms of investing in general, I think behavioral investing books, there's a book called The Little Book of Behavioral Investing. And I think that's more accessible to everybody, regardless of if you're choosing to select individual stocks or, again, an ETF management, because it really gets to the idea of where you might make the behavioral mistakes. And I spent quite a bit of time thinking about that because, again, pulling from the angle of where I was in poker, the idea in poker is risk management comes down to your ability to stay focused on the next hand after a bad situation has just happened, and staying very rational in your approach and not going on tilt, quote unquote, is what happens. And I find that the vagaries of the stock market can definitely lead to that aspect where people start second guessing themselves. So studying the behavioral aspects of investing is an incredibly valuable thing.
Love it. Karen, you said that when you came back from your year away, that you and your wife, I believe, had dug up your financial plan from back in the day. And I'm just curious if you'd be willing to share, comparing that plan to how things have unfolded, what were some of your key observations there?
Yeah, so we look back on it, and definitely, as mentioned earlier, financial freedom was a big part of the value that we were bringing forward. And the idea at that time, it was still in the early phases. The idea of financial independence, retire early or FIRE, was maybe in its early phases of understanding. I think I'd read around this a bit, but it wasn't a core concept that I was following until a few years later. But again, this is with the massive caveat that this is unique to our individual situation and myself as somebody who had done the work to understand my risk tolerance. But a big part of our financial plan was investing essentially as much as we could early. The big decision we made was to lock off one side of our income and say this is not to be touched. So again, we were lucky and fortunate enough to be in a two-physician household. So we just said one of these incomes we are not going to touch at all. It's purely for savings. And number two was a definite bent towards, we were essentially 100% equity portfolio on that risk dynamic that I was feeling comfortable to take on, and so was my wife. The third one that was very atypical, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend this to anyone unless they had a very strong understanding of their risk tolerance and where they're at, was again that study of how much value gets accrued by even just starting 5 years earlier with a large sum of capital invested, and the dynamic of that. And this pulls a little bit back towards something I'd written about on my blog, but to explain in a shorter time period, I had accrued a bit of winnings around poker, and I had to make the decision: do I pay down our student debt from this, or do I invest? Because this appears to be a great moment in time to invest, having been the financial crisis. And after studying this, I very quickly realized this was essentially a question of, do I leverage to invest or not? Because if I chose to invest the money that I'd won from poker into the stock market instead of paying down debt, in and of itself, I was choosing to leverage to invest because I had the option of paying down this personal debt side of the equation. And that sent me on this pathway where very quickly I learned, if I can invest a bit more dollars up front here and I can mitigate the risk of any degree of borrowing, which a high savings rate does mitigate that quite a bit, because you can approach many different kind of risky scenarios like high interest rates, et cetera. You can adjust for them. And so that was a financial decision we made, that instead of buying a house right away, which a lot of our colleagues were, and taking on $1 million mortgages, instead we chose to put a lot into investing and even borrow a bit to invest in that early phase, which really got us off on a very strong footing overall. And I think accelerated our financial plan in a significant way.
Last finance question for me, Kieran, is how do you and your wife as a unit go about thinking how much money are you going to need to live life later, retire? I know retirement is a sort of a nebulous word. It means many different things to different people. But how do you go about answering that question of how much are we going to need?
Yeah, I think, looking back on that financial plan, it was really initially just what the advisor told us is what we need. So that was the initial starting point. So again, if
Yeah.
if you're not going to, having an advisor when you're in the early phases, I think definitely has value for a lot of people, to get some, whether that's fee-based financial advice. I think there's a strong proponent to getting
Mhm.
yourself that financial plan that looks at the holistic aspect. So I would start at that point. As I gained more financial knowledge and started studying fire movement and everything related to it. I think that this idea of the safe withdrawal rate is something of value. If you're looking at having financial freedom early, the safe withdrawal rate is where you'd want to start. And going to a resource, I haven't been on that website in quite some time, but there was, I'm not going to get the website name perfect, but a guy named Big Earn is, I think it's earlyretirementnow.com, has done
Mhm.
incredible work on actually studying all the dynamics of retiring early. And you can input all sorts of variables in terms of how aggressive your investment portfolio is, et cetera. But what it really boils down to is, what is the safe withdrawal rate and what percentage of assets you have versus your expenditures on a pre-tax level. The general rule of thumb a lot of people in the fire community will use is starting off at this 4% rule, which talks about essentially your total amount of investment assets against your amount that you can live on a pre-tax level, and what that withdrawal rate is. So, for example, if you have 100,000 that you want to live on a gross income pre-tax level, you would, for 4%, you need 25 times that amount of expenditure
Mhm.
in your asset profile. So you need 2.5 million of total assets to know that you could safely withdraw 4% per year and have that relatively stay for an early retirement until you pass away. I think there's evidence that maybe that approaches 3%, if you want to really be safe, depending on what the asset allocation you have. But I think that's a good starting point for people to think if they're talking about retiring early, right? I want to caveat that with, even though I was focused on that idea, now I know that I'm not really retiring early in the sense of removing my physician work. I enjoy what I
Mhm.
do. I like having the freedom to adjust the amount that I have to do based on
Mhm.
the stage of life that I'm in. But this idea of coast fire that I've been more introduced to in the last 5 to 6 years is the idea of achieving the retirement amount that you need and now
Mhm.
working the amount you need to just live on
Mhm.
and not needing to put that extra money into savings. I think that probably fits with a lot of professionals in terms of where they actually will see
Mhm.
this finance decision come in. And that can be a very different formula than the 3 to 4% rule.
Appreciate all those insights, Kieran. As we wrap up, some closing thoughts. Feel free to share anything. One thing I would love to ask you is I think you're a really good writer. I think you do a great job explaining things. Are you going to restart your blog one day?
Yeah, and I have to give you credit for this because the nervousness you created in me of asking me on the podcast and thinking, what am I going to talk about during this time, led me to put some thoughts on paper again, and I found myself really enjoying that process of that writing. And I realized in that time away, I had seen that blog as a creative outlet for myself to just sit down and have some time and space. So you sparked my interest in doing it again, and in fact, I actually have started it already just in this last couple of
I
weeks.
love it. I love it.
I created Financially Free MD at Substack, so financiallyfreemd.substack.com, and I'm gonna start putting out some of my old content that I used to have, re-bringing it back,
Oh,
and
I
then
love it.
writing fresh. Excited to produce some content.
I'm really excited to hear that, Kieran. Buddy, it's been great to have you on the show. This was probably the podcast that I was looking most forward to this year, and I'm really glad we got it done. I think there's going to be so much for everybody to soak in and learn about. And Kieran, thanks so much for making time for us.
My pleasure, and I want to thank the community on my behalf because I know how much value I get from listening to your podcast and the various guests that you have, and I think you're doing a great service for
It's my
our
pleasure,
our
man.
professional community. Yeah, thanks so much.
Hey, thanks, buddy. I appreciate that so much. And we will talk soon, okay?
Definitely.
Okay, take care, man.
Cheers. Bye.